Hi, everyone. Welcome to Food Talk Live. I am your host, Danny Nierenberg. This is part of our monthly series presented by the Global Alliance for the Future of Food, the International Fund for Agricultural Development, and Food Tank to highlight the work of the UN Food Systems champions and others in the lead up to the UN Food Systems Summit taking place later this year. Today's conversation is the fifth of 7 panel discussions featuring speakers from around the world. Each panel focuses on one of the Global Alliance 7 calls to action, which help identify critical pathways to create a better future of food. It's my pleasure to co-host this session with Ruth Richardson, the Executive Director of the Global Alliance for the Future of Food and the Chair of the Champions Network for the UN Food Systems Summit. This panel will focus on the following call to action: unlock private, philanthropic, and multilateral investment opportunities in sustainable food systems, and better align those opportunities amongst actors for greater impact. And I'm glad we have a great group of panelists to talk about this. We have Bettina Prato. She's the Senior Coordinator and Leader of the Secretariat for the International Fund for Agricultural Development, Smallholder, and Agri-SME Finance and Investment Network. Prior to this, she was IFAD's Senior Global Engagement Specialist. She holds a PhD in political science from UC Berkeley, a master's degree from George Washington University, and a bachelor's degree from the University of Venice in Italy. I'd also like to welcome Ndidi Nwuneli, the board chair of Nourishing Africa and the co-founder of Sahel Consulting, which is committed to transforming the agriculture and nutrition landscapes in Africa. She is also the co-founder of AACE Foods and the founder of Leap Africa. She holds an MBA from Harvard Business School and was a senior fellow at the Mossavar Rahmani Center for Business and Government at Harvard Kennedy School and an Aspen Institute New Voices Fellow. And we also have Geeta, Sethi, advisor and global lead for food systems at the World Bank. She is the lead architect of the World Bank's food system transformation agenda, and she also manages the bank's program on food loss and food waste reduction. Previously, she was the chief of staff to the climate change vice president and special envoy, the operations and strategy manager for climate change. I want to thank you all for being here and for sharing your expertise. Ruth, again, this is exciting to collaborate with you. Last time we spoke about public finance, and today we want to shift to really private financial flows to help set the scene for this conversation. So I'm wondering if you can take a moment to really walk us through the Global Alliance for the Future of Food's call to action on this topic and really what it entails.
Thanks, Danny, and thanks to everyone who's tuned into this conversation today. Hard to believe that we're talking about the 5th call to action already. For new listeners, the Global Alliance is a strategic alliance of philanthropies working together and with others to transform food systems. Our vision is food systems that are renewable, resilient, healthy, equitable, diverse, inclusive, and interconnected. And to help turn this vision into a reality, we're committed to advancing 7 interconnected calls to action, informed by many years of research and dialogue and engagement, collaboration with others. So today, as you said, Danny, we're looking at bold call to action number 5. As you mentioned, the last one was public finance, so government money flows, how our member states are supporting food systems transformation or not. This is sort of pivoting to look at other funding flows. So it's really about the redirection of financial flows from philanthropy, from major private investors, banks, multilateral donor agencies, and others, away from harmful actors and practices toward desired actions that incentivize, accelerate, and amplify food systems transformation. These funding flows, as we know, are such a critical piece of the puzzle in terms of food systems change. And so we want to explore how we better utilize those funding flows and private funding flows separately, but also together with the public sector funding flows. We think this is an incredibly important lever of change, and so we're super excited to have these experts with us today to share their experience and their expertise. As an example, last year, colleagues at BioVision, IPES Food, and the Institute of Development Studies published a report called Money Flows that revealed that 63% of financial flows that they tracked are still focused too often on tweaking existing systems or business as usual. And that's why this call to action is so important, particularly in light of the UN Food Systems Summit and the recommendations, ideas, and propositions that will be coming out of the summit. They're going to need support, and we need to make sure that that support is really challenging the status quo and moving us towards a better future of food. So for today's discussion, I hope we can dive into some of the following questions. Things like, how can we transform finance so it advances the adoption of agroecology and regenerative practices? What are the opportunities and barriers here? How can we encourage funders to set more ambitious funding targets to support these practices in specific contexts? So what mechanisms are needed to create alignment between like-minded partners and networks? What organizations already exist that are thinking in this way and putting their grants or their investment strategies towards food systems change with the goal of positive transformative change in the food system? So all these questions complement the discussions we had a few weeks ago on public finance, which I encourage everybody to check out on Food Tank's YouTube channel. And I look forward to another rich and engaging session. So if it works for you, Danny, I'd like to dig into a few specific issues and hear from each of our panelists before we open it up to some more general questions. And what I'd like to do is start with Bettina. Bettina, how does the existing infrastructure of food system finance support or detract from things like resilience, diversity, profitability for producers and also for consumers?
Thank you so much for this question. You know, this is it's quite an encompassing question, so it's hard to answer in simple terms about the overall financial architecture, particularly in global terms. So let me point to perhaps two specific aspects of the call to action that I think get to two really important weaknesses or weak spots in the existing financial architecture, both globally and at different levels on smaller scales, you know, at the country level, for example. So over the past few years, you know, working with this network of actors that work in the area of Agri-SME finance, you know, the SAFIN network, something that I've seen over and over again is that, number one, finance in itself does not unlock investment opportunities. You really have to build up those investment opportunities. You have to design, prepare, de-risk those investment opportunities. And this is quite a weak area in the current financial architecture. The second is fragmentation of the landscape. You know, not just fragmentation in terms of many actors being in place that are doing the right thing on a small scale, which to some extent is justifiable, but really significant gaps in terms of types of capital offerings, you know, perhaps earlier stage, you know, greener in orientation, able to support transition to more adaptive practices in agriculture, but also riskier, you know, sort of trying out new things, trying out new business models. So I think that if I were to say two particularly important areas within the current financial ecosystems in which, you know, investors operate around food and agriculture, I would say support to the design of investable opportunities that are really transformative, you know, and aligned with the agenda of more sustainable food systems. And the other side, fragmentation and lack of, particularly of the kinds of capital that are most needed to develop innovative business models.
Fantastic. Thanks, Bettina. And I really appreciate your focus on sort of the de-risking element, which I think is critical as we ask farmers and processors and others to really, as you say, embrace kind of innovative solutions and, you know, to take a chance on some of the bold ideas that we need to help move us towards this kind of change. So very much appreciate sort of that perspective. Danny, over to you.
Thanks so much. And I'm so glad for this conversation. And Bettina mentioned riskier business models. And I think, farmers and people in the investment world are often adverse to risk. But before you answer that, Bettina, let me just introduce Andrew. Andrew, I'm so glad you could make it. Andrew Mushita is the director of the Community Technology Development Trust in Zimbabwe. He has worked for decades with small scale farmers throughout Southern Africa to establish local seed banks and seed trusts. He also serves as a chairperson of the Regional Agricultural and Environmental Initiatives Network and is a member of the Biotechnology Trust of Zimbabwe. Welcome, Andrew. Thank you for joining.
Thank you.
Great. So I was just following up on Ruth's question to Bettina about embracing riskier business models for really transformative food systems. And I was saying that farmers and others in finance and investment are often risk adverse. How do we overcome that kind of mindset?
So, being risk adverse when you are in a business that is as risky as agriculture often is a rational mindset. I mean, it's a rational posture, and I think the agenda we should be tackling is not that of generally speaking encouraging all actors to be taking on more risks. We have to look at the different risk tolerance, risk absorption capacity that different actors have, and really, particularly in the financial ecosystem, and really leverage the capacity to take on greater risks that, for example, providers of concessional capital, development finance institutions that have a strong development mandate, international or national, have. We have to engage from an ecosystem perspective, with different types of financial service providers, and investors, so that those that have a greater capacity to absorb risk in terms of their financial offerings are doing more in this space, but also are better connected with those that are then able to come in, with a lower risk tolerance. Now, this is true when it comes to the financial ecosystem, but you spoke about farmers. In order to strengthen the capacity of farmers to properly assess the risks that are involved with shifting to new practices, as well as be able to afford taking on those risks, we have to strengthen their know-how. We have to strengthen their capacity to access markets, because you take risks for a return expectation. And we also have to strengthen the kind of financial offerings that the ecosystem is able to deliver to farmers to buffer those risks. So it's not just about changing mindsets. As I said, risk aversity is, to some extent, when well informed, it is a rational posture. We have to provide answers to the reasons why it is rational.
Great. Thank you so much for expanding that. Andrew, if I could turn to you now, I think, Bettina brought this up. One of the biggest impediments to resilience for smallholder farmers is debt. It makes them, risk adverse. So if disaster strikes, loans can be near impossible to pay off, and technological infrastructure can be really expensive to maintain. How do we keep investments from harming smallholder farmers?
Thank you very much for that question. I think what is more critical at this day and age is to ensure that farmers or any technological innovations which can be developed are demand driven, and that they are actually serving the interests of smallholder farmers, and that we need to make sure that the investments are also linked with the local, national, and regional markets, which speaks to the kind of agriculture systems which are established in that particular country, so that the farmers have the ability to link with markets and be key players and benefit from those kind of markets which are really designed to reach or to service the interests or the produce of those smallholder farmers, we need to make sure that there is adequate infrastructure, adequate technologies, and also the pricing system is fair and just, so that they will be able to make returns on investment. Because in most cases, the borrowing kind of regimes really have high interest rates which choke the farmers. And then at the end of the day, the farmers will not make any meaningful return on investment, and they will be struggling to pay back those loans. So we need to have a mechanism of facilitating soft loans to the farmers so that they become also actively involved, engaged with the economy, so to speak, within their context, and that they also become key players in the agriculture economic development sector.
Great, thank you so much. Ruth, over to you now.
Thanks, Danny. I want to turn to Geeta. So investment is directed at more than just smallholder farmers, but let's just stick with that for a second, because farmers are such a massive part of the food system equation. And we know, that's where it all starts, is around production, and really looking at sort of farmers' livelihoods. I'm just wondering, based on Andrew's point about making sure that smallholder farmers, other farmers, are actively engaged and involved as key players, what is the World Bank doing, or how do you see more generally how really large institutions like that can connect to farmers, and just to make sure that investments have the most impact for ensuring that farmers' livelihoods are protected?
Thank you, Ruth. First, let me just mention I'm so privileged and honored to be here. It's such a great setting and great conversation. I think the conversation that Bettina and Andrew were part of earlier is exactly right. Before I answer you what the World Bank's view is vis-a-vis farmers and how to really make them part of the solution. But I think the perception of risk in the agriculture sector is very high. And it's also true that capital is moving away. Private capital has been moving away from agriculture and food. It is also true that the perception of risk has a lot to do because there isn't enough data and metrics. And I find that lack of data and metrics always is the other side of the perception of risk. Having said that, I think what is also very important in terms of how we are looking at now food systems transformation, not just in my institution, the World Bank, but also in the way one is thinking globally with what 2020 has reminded us, and the fragility of development, COVID, et cetera, that farmers, the 21st century farmers, are not just producers of food. They're also really the keepers of ecosystems. And I think something that is very relevant in terms of the macro is the price of carbon. I think we cannot have a price of carbon at $5 a ton when we are really thinking about how to create food systems that do not violate planetary boundaries. And farmers are the key keepers of this ecosystem. The social price of carbon that we put into our own analysis across the world hover anything between $50 to $70. And then the market price of carbon is 5 tons. And I think there is a big disconnect, and this needs to get sorted out. Now, for that, do we need some of the kind of MRVs or, to figure out the soil health? I think is also a very important part of the story, but clearly we cannot wait 100 years to work this number out, right? Therefore, then is again to really help the farmers. Can innovation technology leapfrog? Is there a way we can really look at the quality of soil health in terms of really then determining what could be some kind of defined payments to farmers beyond just the food prices that they are producing or the incomes they're getting out of production? And that again links back, that is very important, that when you started, Ruth, you said we dealt with public finance and we want to focus on private. That private finance on its own, and I think others made that point, that they really have to work together, because for the big thing in terms of how to define the price of carbon, how to define soil as an asset class, how to really provide the kind of the policy regulatory framework to allow technologies innovations to move into this direction to help really define what the farmers are really contributing to, because their contribution is much, much, much bigger, and they need to get compensated. To get compensated comes back to, can we rethink about repurposing public support, which is 700 billion, and in 54 countries, the latest numbers suggest. Now, at best, even if one stays away, that this public support is not really creating a carbon-friendly or a planet-friendly, or we look at what's happening, that every second person on this earth, because of the kind of food we are producing and consuming, has some element of malnutrition, means that can we then repurpose this public support in a way that can define this kind of payments to farmers. So I think not just pure investments in terms of how to create efficiency in the value chain, I think we are also really thinking about how to link it to the macro fiscal, to the carbon markets, the regulatory and policy frameworks, to really get farmers to be recognized for the role they are playing in many ways. So let me stop there.
Geeta, thank you. Just a very quick follow-up question. Very much appreciate your point that public and private have to work together. Is that happening? Can you point to any positive examples where those discussions are actually coming together and new solutions are being found in those conversations?
I would say, two things. First, I would like to highlight a statistic that caught even me, a little bit by surprise. In 2019, $2.6 trillion of private finance went into sectors that were the biggest drivers of biodiversity losses, okay? And so I think even though we are creating this big drumbeat and getting the globe to really think about food systems in a way that provides healthy people and healthy planet, the left hand and the right hand still are not coordinated in terms of how private finance is moving into areas, okay? Having said that, it is also true that the food and agricultural sector overall is where maybe energy was a decade or decade and a half ago. And I think the innovation that has happened in terms of public-private, and I think Bettina talked about the de-risking platforms, they're happening, but in boutiques, okay? Can we scale these up? And I think that's really the big focus has been. I mean, what would it take for an Olam of the world to come in a big way and really create efficiencies across the rice in all their procuring countries, not just in Nigeria, not just in Vietnam? I mean, what would it take? What is it they need? What kind of a de-risking instrument needs to be put in place where MDBs and public sector can come in? I think are the kinds of conversations that are happening. There are good examples. There are some good examples in terms of really creating on lending or some lending instruments to SMEs and regional banks to really then allow finance to flow. But I think it was Danny or Bettina, I can't remember, or maybe Andrew, that said that it's still a very fractured landscape. We haven't done a systems approach to this. And I think that's going to be very critical, where we're able to bring the investors, the technology, the multilaterals, the public sector, and really think through, what's going to be a priority, what's going to be how to sequence intervention in a way that the whole system gets recalibrated a little bit. So let me stop there.
Great, thanks, Geeta. Lots of threads there to pick up, Danny.
Yeah, there's a lot going on there. I kind of want to build on that. This idea of addressing a systems approach. And Ndidi, I'm hoping to turn to you. How do we sort of make that systems approach available to expand investment opportunities for farmers' access to regional and global markets? And how can we be really thinking about supporting market access in new ways?
Thank you so much, and well done to all of you for your great remarks and for this wonderful platform. I really believe that the most catalytic agents in the value chains are actually SMEs, small and medium-sized enterprises that either source from these farmers or provide inputs or work with them on logistics, ICT, etc. And I think they serve as critical entry points to reach the most vulnerable communities and the most vulnerable farmers, especially those SMEs that are committed to ethical and inclusive business and sustainable development. And in the financing landscape, it's really important to find those catalytic SMEs and work with them. Not only is it easier to reach them, but they understand the language of the development finance sector and can coordinate large number of farmers through their supply chains or distribution channels. Because of the different hats I wear through Nourishing Africa, which works with SMEs in 34 African countries, ACE Foods, which is an SME itself, and Sahel Consulting, which works with a range of SMEs, we've really seen how important it is to work with these actors called SMEs in the African context. And what I want to underscore from an ecosystems approach are a couple of points, which I want to really note for your 7-point agenda. The first is the importance of equity. And I want to underscore this issue of equity because financial flows are not equitable right now in our landscape. Recent results say that 8 out of 10 startups in Kenya that got funding were from non-Kenyans, mostly Europeans and Americans getting funding in Kenya. In Nigeria, it's about 50%. When you look at the boards of most of these companies that are getting funding to do development work in Africa, especially in the agriculture and food landscape, most of those boards don't have Africans well represented or in senior management position. For me, this is unacceptable. Funding flows to Africa, to Asia, to South America should be equitable. And funders owe it to themselves to actively track how many local organizations are actually getting the financing, because local organizations ensure sustainability, they have their ears on the ground, and they understand how to engage with their own people at lower costs and in a more efficient manner. The second is gender. And we haven't really talked about gender when it comes to an ecosystem approach. And we actively have to track gender. I always challenge anyone who's funding farmers to say, how many female farmers have you funded? In your supply chain and distribution channel with SMEs, how many women are in those channels? We know that if we close the gender gap in the agriculture and food landscape, we transform the entire ecosystem. We address malnutrition, but we also ensure sustainability. And donors and funders and financiers across the board have to actively track this. If it's not measured, it won't happen. And if there's no incentive to ensure that you comply, you're going to see a lot of distortions in the system. And then finally, the ecosystem approach has to involve unusual actors. We often see ourselves very siloed in the food and agriculture landscape. And through the last year, I've realized that we have to cut across that divide and work with our counterparts in climate, financing, and Geeta talked about this, in trade and investment, in gender, in all sorts of ecosystems, in ICT, in technology, and this is at the federal level, at the state level, and in the financing communities. Because if we continue to work in silos, we're going to continue to create distortions, and we're going to continue to create competition for what we see as a shrinking pie, instead of growing the pie collectively. So for me, there's an urgent need for us to work with unusual actors and to pool our resources and actually invest in ecosystem solutions that are designed from the onset, that also not only finance, but shape policy to create an enabling environment. And through one of my projects with the Gates Foundation, focused on unlocking the potential in the dairy sector in Nigeria, it's called Advancing Local Dairy Development. We're actually piloting an ecosystem approach, from the governance structures for this intervention, to working with SMEs, to working with the smallholder farmers, to actually shaping policy. It's complex, it's difficult, it's messy, but it's sustainable. And that's what more funders need to embrace.
I love that we're asking funders to be a little bit more messy. I think that that's clearly needed. And I love this ecosystems approach, and that you mentioned, equity, gender, and really breaking down those silos. That's been a theme throughout these 5 conversations, that we need to, really break down the silos. We've all been talking about it for decades, right? But now is the time to do that. And Ndidi, it's hard though. It's difficult. It's difficult to make all of these things happen. And, as you mentioned, it's messy. How do we encourage, investment to be a little bit more messy?
Well, I've been actually really impressed with the Gates Foundation, with the MasterCard Foundation. and even the US Africa Development Foundation, they seem, and Rockefeller, obviously I sit on the board of Rockefeller, so I'm biased, but they seem to be very committed, these funders, to actually co-designing the process. And I think it starts with the co-design. Don't design an intervention and hope to find partners to implement it. Co-design with the actors at the table so that together we have ownership from the onset. This is critical. The second is embed funding for policy and for communications, because without an enabling environment and without an ability to shape the media, to shape the public opinion, you're lost from day one. And many funders historically haven't funded this and haven't prioritized this. They've just focused on the financing or the programmatic aspect, and they missed the entire need. And then the third is governance. And I talked about advancing local dairy development. At the federal level, we created an ecosystem board that oversees this project. We also, at the state level, replicated a similar structure with folks from water resources and gender and women affairs and ICT, people who ordinarily would say, why are you inviting me to an ecosystem food and nutrition project? But when we get there, they realize. And the importance of M&E, tracking, but tracking that is also rooted in the needs and the realities on the ground. Because in this case, we're working with very disadvantaged rural communities, nomadic dairy communities. And if you don't measure based on the realities, you actually distort incentives as well. So I think, and finally, the most important, which is what I started, let private sector be there. And in this case, SMEs, and let them bring some funding to the table. And they have, because it's a win-win for them if there's an ecosystem that's developed, if they have a guaranteed supply chain, and if it's climate sensitive and it's sustainable. And bringing the private sector on board also ensures what I talked about before, which is that catalytic change agent, that after the funding is finished or the timing is gone, that they continue the work because it makes business sense.
Fantastic. Bettina, I know you want to comment on this as well.
Yes, thank you for this opportunity. I mean, I was struck by what you said, Danielle, about how do we convince investors to be to get more into the messiness of not knowing. Actually, I think that what Ndidi just described is a messy process, but it's a process that makes opportunities and a pathway for investment much clearer and less messy, actually, for investors. For me, what is valuable in the kind of experiences that Ndidi just shared, and also in the kind of approaches to building ecosystems around genuine, solid investment opportunities, like the International Trade Center, Alliances for Action model. Now, also the work that we did as a network around what we call the investment prospectus pilots, the experiences of others, like, I don't know, Grow Africa in the African continent with a different business model. The hand-in-hand initiative that FAO is launching, they're all about trying to see where are the opportunities where we can see markets picking up in not in the long distant future, but in the medium term at least. And how do we actually build the enabling ecosystem around that, from finance, from policy, from governance, and how do we get all the actors around the table? That actually gives a lot, it serves a de-risking function for investors, and it provides guidance to all different actors to know where they are expected to chip in. So for me, actually, it's a complex process, but it's not messy in the sense that it allows it actually allows investors to have a greater sense of clarity in what is often a very opaque market. Particularly for investors that aren't locally based, that are not already familiar with the sector. Over. Sorry for coming in on this point.
No, that was perfect. That was great. Thank you so much, Ruth. Over to you now.
Thanks. I want to pick up on a thread that I'm hearing from all of you, which is really around the deeper values that underpin our food system. There has been criticisms before of focusing too much on efficiency, for instance. And I think one of the real benefits of these conversations and of fora like the UN Food Systems Summit is that we get to come together and talk about the other values that we have to bring to the table. So Andrew, you talked about a food system that is fair and just. Ndidi, you've been talking about equity and gender and having a real ecosystem approach, which I assume means that we underpin food systems with the values of diversity and resilience. Geeta, you yourself talked about resilience and diversity. You've all brought, Bettina, you've all brought these deeper values to this discussion. And what I would like to ask each of you is, how do we actually practically build those values into our institutions? And how do we make sure that the change that we're after is actually in sync with those values, and that we're really bringing them centrally into the kinds of opportunities that we're pursuing? So Geeta, maybe I can start with you, and I'm just going to go around the ring, and I would love to hear from each of you.
Thank you, Ruth. What a great question, and what a difficult question, because it's really hard. I think, you know, there was an event recently that Rabobank had organized, and one of the questions they had there was, what are the lock-ins that are preventing transformation to happen in the food and agriculture space? And I thought a lot about it, because unlike the fossil fuel industry or the energy sector, the food sector doesn't have those kind of lock-ins. But, you know, the lock-in I finally figured out is our mindsets. And I think in some ways, and mindsets are defined by vested interests. I mean, if you look at the big reforms happening in some of the countries and how they got stalled, is really this threat of vested interest, this fear of agribusiness taking over, et cetera, et cetera. And again, the lack of metrics, information, kind of all of this feeds into not creating an environment where one can instill new values. But I actually feel very strongly that 2019, the COVID experience, you know, was very unfortunate, but it did because both global North and global South got hit on the by COVID-19 vis-a-vis the food system, that it really propelled this agenda on top of the radar for the relevant stakeholders. And this is the question now is, and everybody, you know, is also is not everybody. The concern on a future pandemic and the thinking that really food systems is fundamental to reduce immunity is beginning to now dominate mindsets, right? So I see this as a big opportunity where one can now, with accurate information, with the ability to link different data points and really think systemic, one can begin to really bring about, build in the benefits that would accrue to different segments, but also, to be very honest, where there is going to be a trade-off and there are going to be losers with the decision, and then really rethink the social protection or the income support programs in the country. So a long answer, but back to you.
Thank you, Geeta. I know it's a tough question, but I think it's at the heart of what we really need to dig into. So Bettina, maybe I can turn to you next.
Yes, I was listening to Geeta and I was thinking, and I was, you know, nodding because I think we aligned on many of the points that she raised. I think, you know, it's easy to discount the importance of you know, values in the work that we do, working in institutions that, you know, are essentially about investment. If we don't make those, you know, the embodiment of those values tangible in terms of what does it mean for our investment strategies, you know, how do we translate it into something that we can measure, that we can, you know, provide incentives to the different staff and units and partners to work around. So this translating from normative, aspirational to tangible, measurable is for me really, really important. I also liked what Geeta said about you know, the winners and losers. You know, I think we do a lot of pretending that everything is a win-win in this business. Not everything is going to be a win-win. So we have to be to be honest about that, and to really also recognize where the power asymmetries, the power differentials, also the unspoken power differentials, the biases are in place and are affecting very concretely access to resources, access to markets, access to opportunities for change, and really do whatever is in our power as institutions, as network leaders, whatever our roles are, to address those, to bring those to light, not to pretend that they're not there. And finally, I'd get to something that I find really powerful, Ruth, is role modeling. It's a sense of setting, also as individuals within our institutions, trying to set a model for ourselves, for others, for partners, in terms of really embodying those values. Sometimes we underestimate the importance of the individual, of leadership, as an embodied feature in the context of, particularly large bureaucracies. But it is very powerful. And so I would also underline that. It's also very important to make things happen. And I'm saying this also as a champion and part of your network, Ruth, on that front.
Fantastic. Thank you, Bettina. Andrew, I'm going to turn to you next. How you talk about fairness and how do we make sure those are guiding values in terms of how we're advancing food systems reform?
Yeah, thank you. I think, in my view, we need to look at this issue in terms of maybe I would say 4 thematic or pathways which we need to look into. I think the first one is really the policy frameworks which provide the space and opportunities for smallholder farmers to enter into any of these kind of opportunities which exist, especially in the agriculture sector. We need to make sure that the policy framework is premised on the basis of the needs of the different sectors and maybe also the kind of farming communities we have and the resource base which is available at their hands, because otherwise there's a mismatch of policies which do not really address the realities of the sector we want to actually support. In that context, the policy frameworks should then lead to some kind of economic opportunities which exists. And those, how to unlock those kind of economic opportunities, I think the policy space, once it is enabling and actually levels the playing field, then you need long-term private sector investment, because sometimes you have the private sector who come on a short-term basis. They want to invest for 2 years, 3 years. Agriculture is not like that. It's a long-term investment. So if we are serious or if we want to partner with the private sector, they need to come there for a long haul and not just a short-term kind of investment. Because then agriculture is also full of unpredictables. Climate change is one of them, and also we talk about gender, and there's also inequity in those areas, and you need to support and develop those capacity building, technology development, which is actually driven by the needs within the context of these communities. So that brings equity and also fairness. Because if you are coming in there for 2 years and you hope to reap some huge investment, rewards or profits, it will not happen. It needs a long-term kind of agenda where you are committing yourselves to really contribute in that sector. So policy, economic development, which then comes in with small business enterprises, which are really tailored to fit the kind of farmers you have, because they are not going to start with huge business enterprises. They have to be small and conducive to their level of management, their level of innovations, their level of technology capacities. So it has to be tailored, and then there has to be a growth path where you build in. Then you need to have technologies. You need also to have the social-cultural responsibilities built into that kind of investment. and not just looking at the profits only, but you need the social corporate responsibility, which addresses also the different and marginal communities within that society, so that you begin to build equity in the society, and that they also have disposable income to begin to buy into that kind of business model. And they become key participants to that kind of small business enterprises, which is premised on the realities and resource base, which is actually in those kind of communities. So we need to take all these opportunities. The other, maybe finally, the youth engagement is also quite critical. If you look into Africa, probably more than 60% of the population is youth. And in many cases, we tend to overlook this sector of the community. So youth engagement and youth empowerment, economic development, employment opportunity, development within the agriculture sector is key and fundamental to the continent, if I look at the African continent. So we need to take these sectors much more seriously. But I think my biggest take is that private sector need to come in with a long-term goal, not short-term profits. That will not work.
Thank you, Andrew, and thank you very much for elevating the issue of youth and intergenerational equity. Incredibly important issue. Ndidi, finally to you, and then I'll hand it back over to Danny.
Thank you very much. I agree with all the comments that have come before me. I just want to underscore too, Bettina talks about role modeling. I think that is so important because I'm an entrepreneur and a social entrepreneur. I'm able to use my organizations as a beacon of hope, but also as a catalyst in the landscape by trying to set an example for others to enter the ecosystem and also to support them. I've also been doing quite a bit of writing, and I recently released a book called Food Entrepreneurs in Africa, Scaling Resilient Agriculture Businesses. And through this book, I showcase 80 social entrepreneurs and entrepreneurs in the ecosystem who are scaling and who have a lot to share with the rest of us who want to scale. And so writing, research, data is so critical to our work, to change mindsets, to inspire others, and to serve as catalysts. To even shape policy, you need the data, you need the examples. And then the second, underscoring what Bettina said also, is the importance of measurement and evaluation. And it has to be infused throughout the entire organization, from the leadership down to the lowest levels. And I also believe in meritocracies, but if you don't measure collaboration, I mean, now in our HR approaches for evaluations, we actually measure whether our team members are collaborating with other organizations, because there's a need to leave our egos and logos at the door and actually come together to solve problems collaboratively. And you have to reward that instead of penalizing that. In addition, the importance of, if it's not measured, it doesn't matter. So what about how many women? What about local organizations? What about youth organizations? And our sister company, Sahel Capital, which manages the Fund for Agriculture Financing, actually actively tracks the number of jobs created that are for young people, that are for women, through their SME investments that are catalytic. And that not only inspires them to actively seek investee companies that can deliver on those mandates, but investee companies that share those values. And I think for financiers in the ecosystem, having that lens and actively tracking that matrix not only changes your behavior, but makes you, forces you to make different decisions. And so we're starting to see this bubbling up in our ecosystem, and we need to see a lot more momentum to drive change.
Fantastic. I love the line, leave our egos and our logos at the door. That's awesome. And really measuring investments in terms of youth and gender equity and other things that really matter. I love that we've had a global audience during this discussion. So I want to bring in some of the questions. Bernie, my co-founder, hits on the back end. Could you bring in Gabriella's first question, Bernie? So finance out without capacity building can lead to short-term results. To ensure medium and long-term impact, working closely with all actors is necessary. How to achieve this in a business as usual mindset? Anyone want to jump in first?
I can take this one. So I really believe in training and supporting SMEs and farmers with the business knowledge and the support they require. And through Nourishing Africa, we launched an entrepreneur support program for about 2,000 SME entrepreneurs, mostly women. And we've seen how important it is to enabling them to pivot. Some of this training actually dwarfs financing. After the training, they realize they actually do not require financing, or the financing they thought they required, and that they can grow another way. And so it opens your eyes to the opportunities in your landscape, and also to networks that you can leverage to grow. And so BDS is critical, and we need to ensure that there are more ecosystem approaches to business development services and more collaboration north-south. In fact, one of my game changer ideas is around another virtual hub that helps SMEs with innovations around new product developments, because I feel that supporting them with new product developments that of nutritious food allows for scaling. And north-south and global exchanges not only help us to become better, but also help us to learn from people's failures and successes and to replicate in our own ecosystem.
I love the north to south and south to north collaboration. So necessary. Bettina, I know you wanted to comment on this as well.
Yes, just a small point. First of all, I don't think that we should try and stay within businesses as usual. I mean, as Ndidi said, there is actually quite a bit of energy around coming up with business as unusual or new business models also within the space of technical assistance. But something that I wanted to point out is that, you're seeing nowadays many more business development service providers, as well as, companies that are providing technical assistance to the farmers or the SMEs, and or through the SMEs that work in their supply chains, integrating, environmental sustainability aspects into their curricula. Aspects related to nutrition impact sometimes, but also inclusion. So I think that there is space to work within the existing models and add, shift towards a sort of a thicker, sort of more refined quality of business development services, where we really have significant gaps. From what I can see is around having solid data about the how certain access to certain types of business development services, leads or correlates with greater access to finance. So the data around this correlation, what types of business development service support is most highly correlated with actual, increasing bankability, what difference it makes for investors, is still an area where I think we need to invest a little bit on the knowledge side.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Ruth, I want to give you enough time to have concluding remarks.
Thanks, Danny. And you've probably seen me madly scribbling away on the side here as I try to listen intently and capture everything that you guys have said and make some sense of it. So I'm going to try. But first, just to say thank you so much. This has been an absolutely fantastic conversation, and you all just bring such a wealth of experience and expertise and knowledge. So just want to appreciate that right up front. So just in terms of trying to make some sense of what we've heard today, I've essentially chunked this out into 3 sections. The first is sort of around some of the issues that we have to deal with, understanding what some of the problems are. So first of all, there's sort of the fragmentation and the fracture of the sector and investors and understanding different institutions and the opportunities. So that fragmentation and fracture, number one, sort of issue that we've got to deal with. Number 2 is, I think I want to pick up Bettina's point about not assuming that investment opportunities in finance are connected and that one leads to the other, that these sorts of investment opportunities have to be designed and prepared for and tended to. So I think that that's another really important issue. Number 3 is that a point I think Geeta made, that private capital is actually moving away from this. And so obviously a big issue, a big problem if we're looking to invest in these solutions and really put food systems at the center of the solution set for many of the issues that we're facing, like COVID. Number 4 is a point I think Andrew talked about quite articulately around long-term versus short-term, that many funders have very short-term horizons, and we really need to think about the longer-term horizons. Number 5 is all the very good conversations we had about risk. Risk is a big, big part of this. And there are many dimensions of that, which I can't get into right now, but just to say there's lots that we could unpack around risk. And then finally, is the power differentials, and just understanding that there are a lot of power differentials within the financing world, particularly in terms of who has a seat at the table, who's part of the decision-making process. So we'll talk about that when I flip to solutions, but many of you have touched on the aspects of power differential and how we sort of balance the tables there. So those would be my top kind of issues and problems. In terms of solutions, I will just list in no particular order some of the things I've heard. One is that, again, trying to address the fragmentation and fractured landscape, is we need to be more interconnected. We need to create an ecosystem landscape. We need to understand how private and public come together, particularly the repurposing of public support, and how those financial offerings come together and are mutually supportive of one another. We need to strengthen know-how. This is around sort of knowledge and sort of understanding of the system, understanding of the opportunities. Number 3, interesting comments around, I'm going to lump a bunch of things together, co-designing with actors at the table. This gets back to the power differentials. Who's at the table? How do we co-design? How do we make sure, for instance, that the way we're designing markets is connected to smallholder farmers and is in service of those smallholder farmers? So some really interesting things in there around, how we're working with different actors, and particularly those actors that are, on the ground. Adequate infrastructure was mentioned. A lot in there around new actors and collaborations. How do we bring in new actors? How do we connect those actors? Some interesting comments about role modeling and training and capacity building. And then towards the end, we started to get into measurement and evaluation, which of course is critical in this. And there are a number of comments around you can't see what you don't measure, and we need to make sure that those things are visible and that we're measuring the right things. Which leads me to my final point, which is what are we measuring, and the importance of values in that, in helping us determine what types of things we want to measure. And so again, you guys have talked about intergenerational equity and youth, fairness and justice, equity, gender, resilience and diversity, ensuring that those values are at the center of this entire conversation, and how we're setting up our funding flows to actually support those sort of deeper values. So that's my quick summary off the top of my head, Danny. Thank you so much for all those contributions, and I will hand it back over to you.
Thank you so much. This conversation could go on for hours. It was really rich and full of so much great information. I want to thank Ruth and all of the panelists and all of you for watching and listening today. A reminder that this episode will also be available on our podcast, Food Talk with Danny Nierenberg. And please join us again on May 19th at 11 a.m. Eastern Time, when we'll be discussing ecological solutions for stronger communities. Thank you all again, and please stay safe, and I hope to see you all soon.